There can be a subtle shift in how your attention behaves long before you recognize it as a problem. It does not begin as an obvious loss of focus, and it rarely feels like something is wrong. Yet, the way your mind moves through tasks can start to change in small and quiet ways. You may notice that staying with one thing requires slightly more effort than it used to, even when the task itself has not become more difficult. At first, this change feels insignificant and easy to overlook because your mind remains active and still capable of engaging with information. However, the way that engagement unfolds begins to lose depth as attention moves more quickly between points without fully settling into any single one. In moments where nothing is demanding your focus, your mind may begin to reach outward, not because something is necessary, but because stillness no longer feels complete on its own. This movement is not driven by urgency, and it does not feel forced. Yet it carries a quiet sense that something else might be more engaging than what is currently in front of you. Over time, these small shifts begin to form a pattern that is difficult to notice while it is developing, because it does not interrupt your ability to function. You can still think, respond, and complete tasks, but the way your attention holds on to a single idea becomes less stable. Instead of remaining with one line of thought, your mind begins to transition more easily, moving between inputs with less resistance than before. As this pattern develops, your brain begins to adjust what it considers worth paying attention to, even if you are not consciously aware of that change. Dopamine plays a central role in this process, not by creating pleasure alone, but by marking certain experiences as significant enough to return to again. When stimulation is frequent and delivered in short intervals, the brain begins to register that pattern as normal, gradually shifting its internal expectations. This means that attention is no longer guided by importance or intention, but by how quickly and consistently something can trigger that response. Over time, this reshapes the baseline of what feels engaging, making slower or less stimulating activities feel less rewarding than they once were. The task itself has not lost its value, yet the brain begins to interpret it differently because it no longer matches the expected level of stimulation. As a result, focus becomes harder to sustain, not because of a lack of ability, but because the system that supports attention has adapted to a different rhythm. This is how dopamine overload quietly begins to redefine what your mind is willing to stay with. As this baseline continues to shift, the way your brain responds to ordinary experiences begins to change in ways that are not immediately obvious. Things that once felt neutral or mildly engaging can start to feel less interesting. Not because they have changed, but because your system has adapted to expect stronger and more immediate stimulation. This creates a quiet imbalance where high-intensity inputs become the reference point against which everything else is unconsciously evaluated. When that happens, slower activities begin to feel unusually flat, even when they require meaningful attention and are still objectively valuable. The mind does not interpret this difference as a change in pace, but instead as a lack of engagement, which makes it harder to remain present with what is in front of you. As a result, attention begins to drift more quickly, not out of intention, but because the brain is searching for something that better matches its current expectations. This search operates in the background, subtly pulling your focus toward whatever offers a stronger or more immediate response. Over time, this reduces the range of experiences that can naturally hold your attention, making it easier to disengage even from tasks that you once found manageable. Because of this, the difficulty is not limited to specific situations, but begins to appear across different areas of your daily life. What you are experiencing is not simply distraction, but a gradual narrowing of what your attention system is able to sustain without external stimulation. As this pattern continues, a more subtle change begins to appear in how you experience moments without stimulation. The difficulty is no longer limited to staying focused on a task, but starts to extend into how you relate to stillness itself. When there is nothing actively engaging your attention, the absence of input can begin to feel slightly uncomfortable. This discomfort is not intense or alarming, yet it is noticeable enough to create a quiet urge to fill the space. The mind does not remain at rest for long, and instead begins to search for something to engage with, even when nothing is required. This response develops gradually, as the brain becomes accustomed to operating in environments where stimulation is continuous and easily accessible. Over time, the system adapts by treating constant input as the baseline condition rather than something occasional. Because of this, the absence of stimulation is no longer neutral and can begin to register as something incomplete. This is where the ability to tolerate low levels of stimulation begins to weaken. Not because you are unwilling to stay still, but because your brain has learned to associate engagement with normality. As a result, stillness starts to feel less familiar, and maintaining it requires more intention than before. This shift makes focus more difficult, because sustained attention depends on the ability to remain present without needing constant variation. As the system adapts further, the response to low stimulation does not remain neutral, but begins to carry a subtle sense of unease that is easy to overlook. This unease is not strong enough to interrupt your behavior directly, yet it is consistent enough to influence what you choose to do next. When there is a moment without input, the mind does not settle into that space, but instead begins to look for something that can restore a sense of engagement. This reaction is not based on necessity, but on what the brain has learned to expect as its normal operating condition. Because stimulation has been frequent and easily accessible, the absence of it can begin to feel like something is missing, even when nothing is actually lacking. Over time, this creates a pattern where stillness is no longer experienced as rest, but as a state that requires correction. The mind starts to associate inactivity with a subtle form of discomfort and activity with relief, even when that activity is not meaningful. As this pattern repeats, the brain reinforces a simple rule that operates beneath awareness. Remaining in low stimulation becomes less desirable, while seeking input becomes automatic. This is how a dependence on stimulation forms, not through intention, but through repeated adaptation to an environment that rarely allows attention to remain undisturbed. As this pattern continues to repeat, it begins to shift from a tendency into a response that happens automatically, without requiring conscious decision. The moment a slight sense of disengagement appears, the mind moves toward stimulation almost immediately, not as a deliberate choice, but as a learned reaction shaped by repetition. This is where the structure changes from preference into conditioning, because the behavior is no longer evaluated each time, but executed based on what has been reinforced over time. You may notice that your hand reaches for your phone before you fully register the impulse, or that your attention shifts before you have the chance to question it. This does not happen because awareness is absent, but because the response has been trained to occur faster than reflection. The brain begins to predict that stimulation will resolve the subtle discomfort of low engagement, and it acts on that prediction with increasing efficiency. As this prediction becomes more reliable, the gap between impulse and action becomes shorter, making the behavior feel automatic rather than chosen. Over time, this reduces the role of intention in how attention is directed, replacing it with a system that prioritizes speed and familiarity. Focus is no longer interrupted only by external distractions, but by an internal pattern that has learned to anticipate and seek stimulation. This is why the experience can feel difficult to control, even when you are aware of what is happening. What begins as a small reaction to discomfort can gradually organize into a repeating loop that operates with increasing consistency. A moment of low engagement introduces a subtle sense of unease, and that unease creates a tendency to move toward something easier to process. The shift itself feels minor, yet the relief that follows reinforces the behavior in a way that is not immediately visible. Because the brain registers that relief as useful, it begins to favor the same response the next time a similar state appears. With repetition, the sequence becomes more efficient, reducing the space between discomfort and reaction until they begin to overlap. At that point, the process no longer requires conscious involvement, and attention starts to move according to a pattern rather than a decision. This is how the loop stabilizes, not through intensity, but through familiarity that removes the need to evaluate each moment independently. Over time, this structure begins to influence how long you remain with any experience that does not provide immediate engagement. Focus becomes more fragile, not because the task is too difficult, but because the system has learned to exit before discomfort fully develops. What feels like distraction is often a conditioned response that has been repeated enough to feel automatic. This pattern does not only interrupt focus after it begins, but can influence whether you engage with a task at all. Before attention is fully directed, there can be a brief moment where the mind evaluates what the experience might feel like. If the task is expected to require sustained effort without immediate stimulation, that anticipation alone can create resistance. The resistance is not loud or forceful, yet it is enough to delay action or redirect attention toward something easier to begin. This is where avoidance starts to operate before focus is even established, shaping behavior at the level of initiation rather than interruption. Instead of leaving a task midway, the mind begins to hesitate at the threshold, reducing the likelihood that deeper engagement will occur. Over time, this changes how tasks are selected, favoring those that align with the current stimulation baseline, while gradually excluding those that require sustained attention. Because this process is subtle, it rarely feels like avoidance, and instead appears as a preference or a shift in interest. However, the underlying mechanism remains consistent, as the brain continues to prioritize what feels immediately manageable over what requires adjustment. As this continues, the range of tasks you are willing to engage with begins to narrow, even if your intentions remain the same. This is how focus becomes difficult before it even begins, shaped not by ability, but by the structure that now governs your attention. This narrowing of attention does not always reduce how active you appear, and in many cases, it can create the opposite impression. You may find yourself moving between tasks more frequently, responding quickly, and staying constantly engaged with something throughout the day. From the outside, this can look like productivity, because your attention is always in motion and rarely idle. However, the depth of that engagement begins to change, as each interaction becomes shorter and less sustained than it would need to be for meaningful progress. Instead of remaining with one task long enough to fully develop it, attention shifts before that depth can be reached, creating a pattern of partial completion. Because each action still produces a small sense of progress, the system continues to feel active and responsive, even when it is not producing meaningful results. This creates a form of productivity that is based on movement rather than depth, where being occupied replaces the need to be fully engaged. Over time, this pattern becomes difficult to recognize because it does not feel like avoidance, but like continuous activity. The mind remains busy, yet the amount of deep, sustained work begins to decrease in ways that are easy to overlook. This is how attention can appear productive while gradually losing its ability to concentrate in a meaningful way. When this pattern continues over a longer period of time, the effect begins to extend beyond attention and into how you think. Focus is not only about staying on a task, but about allowing thoughts to develop with enough continuity to form something complete. When attention becomes fragmented, thinking follows the same structure, moving quickly between ideas without staying long enough to fully process them. This does not immediately feel like a loss, because the mind is still active and capable of generating responses. However, the depth of those responses begins to change as thoughts become shorter, less connected, and more reactive to immediate input. Instead of building on a single line of reasoning, the mind begins to shift before that reasoning can be fully explored. This reduces the ability to hold complex ideas in place, making it harder to connect different pieces of information into a coherent understanding. Over time, this affects how you interpret situations, as decisions begin to rely more on surface impressions than on deeper evaluation. The difference is subtle, yet it becomes more noticeable in moments that require sustained thinking, where clarity feels harder to reach. Because the system is no longer used to maintaining attention for extended periods, deeper thought begins to require more effort than it once did. This can create a tendency to simplify problems, not because they are simple, but because staying with complexity feels increasingly difficult. As this continues, the structure of your thinking begins to adapt to shorter cycles, favoring quick conclusions over developed understanding. This is how attention loss gradually turns into a shift in how you process the world. This shift in how you think does not remain limited to cognition, but begins to influence how you experience your internal state. When attention becomes fragmented, emotions are processed in shorter intervals, without the time required to fully understand or regulate them. Instead of allowing a feeling to unfold and settle, the mind moves past it quickly, often before it has been clearly recognized. This creates a pattern where emotional signals are registered but not fully integrated, leaving a sense of unresolved tension beneath the surface. Because the system is no longer accustomed to staying with a single state for long, even mild discomfort can begin to feel more persistent than it actually is. The mind does not remain with the feeling long enough to process it. Yet it also does not fully release it, creating a continuous low-level activation. Over time, this can appear as general restlessness or background anxiety, even when there is no specific cause that can be clearly identified. At the same time, the constant movement of attention prevents deeper recovery, because rest requires the ability to remain in a state without seeking change. When that ability is weakened, even moments of pause may not feel restorative as the system continues to search for stimulation. This is how fragmented attention begins to influence emotional stability, not through intensity, but through the absence of sustained processing. What begins to break down at this stage is not only focus or emotional clarity, but the system responsible for recovery. Rest is not simply the absence of activity, but the ability to remain in a state without needing to change it. When attention has been conditioned to seek constant stimulation, that ability becomes less accessible over time. Even when you stop working, the mind does not fully disengage because it continues to look for something to interact with. This creates a situation where you are physically resting, yet mentally still active in a way that prevents full recovery. The system does not recognize stillness as a complete state, and instead treats it as something that needs to be filled. Because of this, recovery becomes fragmented in the same way attention has become fragmented. Short breaks may provide temporary relief, but they do not allow the system to settle deeply enough to reset. Over time, this leads to a persistent sense of fatigue that does not fully resolve, even when you believe you have taken time to rest. The problem is not the lack of rest itself, but the inability to remain in it long enough for recovery to occur. This is how stimulation dependence begins to interfere with the body's natural ability to restore balance. At this point, the solution is often misunderstood, because the instinct is to focus on improving discipline rather than examining the structure that produced the problem. Trying to force concentration within the same conditions that weakened it rarely leads to lasting change, since the underlying system continues to reinforce the same patterns. What needs to shift is not simply behavior, but the baseline that determines what your brain expects as normal. This baseline has been shaped through repeated exposure to high-frequency stimulation, and it cannot be reset through effort alone. Instead, it requires a gradual reduction in the intensity and frequency of the inputs that have been reinforcing the current pattern. This does not mean removing all stimulation, but changing how often and how quickly your attention is redirected. The goal is not to eliminate engagement, but to allow your system to experience lower levels of stimulation without immediately compensating for them. When this begins to happen, the initial response is often discomfort, because the brain is adjusting to a condition that no longer matches its expectations. That discomfort is not a sign of failure, but an indication that the baseline is starting to shift. If you remain within that state without reacting to it immediately, the system begins to recalibrate what it considers normal. Over time, this creates space for attention to stabilize, not through force, but through a gradual change in what your brain is willing to stay with. The process of resetting your baseline does not begin with a drastic change, but with small adjustments that alter how your attention is exposed to stimulation throughout the day. One of the most effective shifts is reducing the frequency of interruptions, not by removing them entirely, but by creating longer intervals where your attention remains with a single activity. This changes the rhythm of engagement, allowing your brain to experience continuity again, even if that continuity feels unfamiliar at first. Another important adjustment involves how you respond to moments of low stimulation, especially when the impulse to reach for something more engaging appears. Instead of reacting immediately, allowing that impulse to exist without acting on it begins to weaken the automatic link between discomfort and stimulation. This does not eliminate the urge, but it creates a gap where the system can begin to recalibrate. Over time, these gaps become more accessible, making it easier to remain present without needing constant variation. It is also important to recognize that not all stimulation needs to be removed, but the intensity and speed of it should be moderated. Choosing slower forms of engagement, such as reading or sustained tasks, helps reintroduce patterns that support deeper focus. As these adjustments accumulate, the baseline begins to shift gradually, making focus feel less forced and more aligned with how your attention naturally operates. What often happens after this initial adjustment is not a steady improvement, but a gradual return to the previous pattern. The system does not resist change in an obvious way, yet it continues to favor what has been reinforced most consistently over time. Even after creating space for lower stimulation, the brain still holds the memory of faster, more immediate engagement as the easier option. Because of this, moments of fatigue or low motivation can quickly reactivate the old pattern, not through failure, but through familiarity. This is why the shift can feel temporary, as if the system returns to its previous state without a clear reason. The underlying structure has not disappeared, and it remains available whenever the conditions allow it to reemerge. What determines whether the change holds is not intensity, but consistency in how attention is managed across different situations. If the environment continues to provide frequent high-intensity stimulation, the baseline can rise again without being noticed. Sustaining the change requires recognizing that the system adapts continuously, and that attention must be shaped through repeated conditions rather than isolated effort. This means that recovery is not a one-time correction, but an ongoing adjustment of what your brain is exposed to and how often that exposure occurs. What this entire process reveals is that focus is not something you simply lose, but something that is gradually reshaped by the conditions your mind is exposed to. The difficulty is not rooted in a lack of discipline, but in a system that has adapted to prioritize speed, variation, and immediate engagement over depth and continuity. When attention is trained in this way, the problem is no longer about trying harder, but about recognizing what your brain has come to expect as normal. This expectation influences not only how long you can focus, but what you are willing to stay with, how you process information, and how you respond to moments of stillness. Understanding this changes the question from how to force concentration into how to reshape the environment that defines your attention. The most important shift is not eliminating all distractions, but reducing the dominance of high-intensity stimulation so that your system can recalibrate. Allowing moments of lower stimulation to exist without immediately correcting them becomes a key point of change, even if it feels unfamiliar at first. Over time, this creates the conditions for attention to stabilize naturally, without relying on constant effort. What you are rebuilding is not just focus, but the ability to remain with an experience long enough for depth to form. This is where meaningful concentration begins to return, not as something forced, but as something your system can sustain again.